The Room Reserved for a Dead Woman, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Unclaimed Reservation. England, 1958. The rain had ended shortly before 4 o'clock, leaving the streets of Kings Abbot damp and gleaming beneath a pale autumn sun. The village was preparing for the annual harvest exhibition, a tradition so old that nobody could quite remember when it had begun. Baskets of apples sat outside cottage doors. Chrysanthemums filled church windows. Farmers discussed weather forecasts with the solemnity of military strategists. At the centre of the preparations stood the Black Swan Hotel. Though called a hotel, it was more accurately a large coaching inn that had been expanded several times over the centuries. Its oak beams leaned at questionable angles. Floors creaked with alarming enthusiasm, yet visitors adored it. Its owner, Mrs. Hester Baines, often said that if the building ever stopped groaning, she would worry it had died. On that particular Thursday afternoon, she stood behind the reception desk studying the reservations ledger. A frown appeared on her face. She adjusted her spectacles. Then she frowned again. "That's odd." Her husband looked up from a newspaper. "What is?" Mrs. Baines tapped the open page. "This booking." "Which booking?" "Room 7. Mr. Baines shrugged. "What's strange about it?" "The guest arrived yesterday. And? She never checked in." He folded the newspaper. "People cancel." Not after paying in advance. That was true. The reservation had been made nearly 3 weeks earlier. The name written carefully in blue ink read, Mrs. Violet Harrow, arrival, October 16th, duration, 5 nights, payment, complete special request, quiet room overlooking churchyard. Mrs. Baines frowned once more. "I waited all evening." Perhaps her train was delayed. There were no delays. Then she changed her mind. Without writing, Mr. Baines returned to his newspaper. "I dare say people do stranger things." Yet the reservation continued to bother her. She could not have explained why. Perhaps it was because guests rarely paid for an entire stay in advance. Perhaps it was because the handwriting on the reservation form was unusually neat. Or perhaps it was because she had spoken with Mrs. Harrow on the telephone. Only once, for less than 3 minutes. Yet the voice had lingered in memory. Educated, soft, careful. A woman who weighed every word before speaking. "Please ensure the room faces the churchyard." Mrs. Baines could still hear the request. Not because it was unusual, because the woman had sounded oddly anxious, as though the view mattered very much indeed. The hotel door opened. A gust of cool air entered. 3 ladies from the Women's Institute arrived carrying flower arrangements. Conversation immediately filled the lobby. Within minutes, the matter of the missing guest slipped from Mrs. Baines's mind. For a time. Several miles away, Miss Jane Marple sat beside a cottage window knitting a pale blue scarf. The afternoon light fell across her silver hair. A kettle murmured gently on the stove. Visitors frequently underestimated Miss Marple. Some considered her harmless. Others considered her absent-minded. Neither judgment survived prolonged acquaintance. At present she was entertaining Mrs. Elspeth Cartwright, whose principal hobby involved collecting information about other people. "Have you heard?" asked Mrs. Cartwright. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Heard what?" "The hotel has a mystery." "Only one," Mrs. Cartwright laughed. "You know what I mean. Tell me." "There is a woman who never arrived," Miss Marple continued knitting. "That sounds disappointing rather than mysterious. Paid in advance." "Oh? And vanished. Perhaps she missed her train." "So everyone says." Mrs. Cartwright leaned forward. "But I asked Hester Baines." Miss Marple noted the use of the word asked. Experience suggested it had been closer to interrogation. "And what did Mrs. Baines say?" "She believes something feels wrong." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "That is not evidence." "No, but it is occasionally interesting." Mrs. Cartwright brightened. "Exactly." The conversation drifted elsewhere. Harvest competitions, church repairs, a disagreement regarding prize pumpkins. Yet later, after her visitor departed, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the absent guest. Not because of the disappearance itself. People failed to arrive somewhere every day. What interested her was the hotel owner's reaction. Mrs. Baines was not prone to melodrama. If she felt uneasy, there was usually a reason. The following morning brought market day. Villagers gathered around stalls laden with vegetables and preserves. Children chased one another around the square. Dogs investigated unattended baskets. Near noon, a motor car arrived. It was dark green and considerably more expensive than anything normally seen in Kings Abbot. The driver parked outside the police station. Within minutes, he entered, carrying a leather briefcase. Constable Arthur Finch observed him through the window. The newcomer was tall, well-dressed, around 50. His expression suggested a man accustomed to unpleasant news. 10 minutes later, Inspector Roland Pierce emerged from his office. His face had altered noticeably. Constable Finch immediately recognized the look. Something important had happened. The inspector summoned him inside, closed the door. Finch obeyed. The visitor stood by the desk. He removed his gloves. "Constable, this is Mr. Julian Mercer." The man nodded politely. Inspector Pierce continued. "Mr. Mercer is a solicitor from London." The silence that followed seemed deliberate. Finch waited. "The missing hotel guest," said the inspector. "Mrs. Violet Harrow?" "Yes." Mr. Mercer cleared his throat. "I am her legal representative." Finch felt a faint stir of interest. "Has she been found?" "No." The solicitor hesitated. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. "I received a letter from her 3 days after she was supposed to arrive here." Inspector Pierce folded his arms. "What did it say?" Mr. Mercer opened the briefcase. Carefully, he removed an envelope. "The letter instructed me to contact the police immediately if she failed to return home by October 20th. Finch stared. Why would she do that? "Because," said Mr. Mercer quietly, "she believed someone intended to kill her." The room became very still. Inspector Pierce accepted the document. The letter was handwritten, dated October 12th, 4 days before Mrs. Harrow's scheduled arrival. Its contents were brief. "If I have not contacted my solicitor by October 20th, I ask that the matter be investigated immediately. I am not ill. I have no intention of travelling elsewhere. Should I disappear, it will not be voluntary. Please do not dismiss this warning. Violet Harrow." Constable Finch felt the hairs on his neck rise. Not from fear, from certainty. A missing traveller was one thing. A woman predicting her own disappearance was quite another. Inspector Pierce looked up. "When was the last confirmed sighting?" Mr. Mercer answered. "Paddington Station." "Who saw her?" "A porter." "Any family?" "No husband, no children." "Friends?" "A few." The solicitor paused, then added, "Mrs. Harrow recently became concerned about certain events from her past." "What events?" "I don't know." The answer sounded genuine. Inspector Pierce examined the letter again. "What was she like?" Mr. Mercer considered. "Cautious." "Enemies?" "Not that I knew." "Financial difficulties?" "No." "Affair?" "I cannot say." The inspector tapped the paper. "Yet she expected danger." "Yes." No one spoke for several moments. Outside, market day voices drifted faintly through the open window. Inside, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The case was no longer about an absent guest. It was about a woman who had reserved a room, vanished before reaching it, and left behind a written prediction of her own disappearance. That evening, the news spread through Kings Abbot with remarkable speed. By supper time, nearly every resident possessed an opinion. By bedtime, most possessed 3. The Black Swan's dining room buzzed with speculation. "A blackmailer," suggested one man. "Run away with a lover," said another. "Nonsense," replied his wife. "If she planned to disappear, why warn a solicitor?" The debate continued for hours. Meanwhile, in her cottage, Miss Marple listened as the church bell marked 8 o'clock. She sat beside the fire. A newspaper rested unopened on her lap. Her thoughts had settled upon a single detail, not the warning letter, not the disappearance, not even the possibility of murder. The room request, a quiet room overlooking the churchyard. Such preferences often revealed more than people intended. One chose a view for a reason: comfort, memory, fear, curiosity. Miss Marple gazed into the firelight. Somewhere in the puzzle lay a very human explanation, and human explanations, she had long ago learned, were far more revealing than dramatic ones. Outside, autumn wind moved softly through the trees. Inside room 7 of the Black Swan Hotel, the bed remained untouched. The curtains remained undisturbed. The guest book still awaited a signature, and on the bedside table sat a small welcome card bearing the name Mrs. Violet Harrow. A room prepared for a woman who had never arrived. Or perhaps, Miss Marple would later wonder, a room prepared for a woman who had arrived far sooner than anyone realized. Chapter 2. Footprints in Wet Clay. The following morning dawned grey and damp. A veil of mist lingered over the fields beyond Kings Abbot, softening hedgerows and blurring distant cottages into uncertain shapes. Church bells carried farther in weather like that. Their sound drifted across the village with a melancholy quality that suited the growing mystery. By breakfast time, Violet Harrow's disappearance had become the sole topic of conversation. At the butcher's shop, customers discussed it while pretending to examine cuts of lamb. At the post office, letters changed hands more slowly than usual because everyone was busy exchanging theories. At the Black Swan Hotel, several guests extended their stays simply to watch events unfold. Mrs. Hester Baines disliked this intensely. "People behave as though it's a theatre performance," she complained while arranging teacups. Her husband shrugged. "People enjoy mysteries. They enjoy gossip. Same thing, usually." Mrs. Baines was about to disagree when the hotel door opened. Inspector Roland Pierce entered. The room immediately fell quiet. Few things silence a crowd faster than the arrival of a police inspector. Pierce nodded politely. "Morning." Several customers murmured greetings. He approached the reception desk. "I'd like another look at room 7. Mrs. Baines produced the key at once. "Of course." The inspector climbed the narrow staircase alone. Room 7 sat at the far end of the corridor. It was exactly as it had been since the day Violet Harrow was expected. The bed remained neatly made, the wardrobe stood empty, the washstand was untouched. No suitcase had ever crossed the threshold. Yet Inspector Pierce examined every corner carefully. He opened drawers, checked beneath furniture, studied the window. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable. Then he noticed something odd. A faint smear of dried clay stained the exterior windowsill. He bent closer. The mark was small, easy to overlook, yet it did not belong there. The hotel maid cleaned windows every Tuesday. This clay had appeared afterward. Pierce touched it gently. Still intact despite recent rain, which meant it had been sheltered. His gaze shifted toward the narrow strip of roofing beneath the window. More traces, very faint, barely visible, but present. Someone had stepped there. Not recently, days ago. The inspector frowned. The discovery raised an immediate question. Why would anyone climb to the window of an empty hotel room? By noon, the police had examined the exterior wall. The answer proved unsettling. The ivy growing along one side of the building had been disturbed. Not enough for casual observation, enough for an experienced eye. Someone had climbed. Whether up or down remained uncertain. Constable Arthur Finch stood below the window. "You think the missing woman did it?" Pierce shook his head. "Not likely." "Why not? If she had checked in secretly, someone would have seen her." Finch considered. "Then someone else climbed up." "Possibly. To search the room." Pierce looked toward the window. "That depends. On what? Whether they expected to find something there." The possibility lingered. A missing woman, a room she never occupied, and now evidence that someone had reached the room after her disappearance. The mystery was becoming stranger. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor. Not Mrs. Cartwright, not one of the village ladies. Inspector Pierce himself. He arrived carrying a polite expression and a degree of reluctance. Miss Marple welcomed him warmly. "Tea, Inspector?" "Thank you." He accepted the offer. Most police officers claimed they consulted Miss Marple only out of courtesy. Most eventually discovered otherwise. The inspector described the latest developments, the reservation, the warning letter, the disturbed window, the traces of clay. Miss Marple listened without interruption. When he finished, she stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Very curious." "Indeed. What do you make of it?" The inspector smiled faintly. "I was hoping you might tell me." Miss Marple returned the smile. "A dangerous expectation. One I have occasionally found rewarding," she considered. "The climbing interests me less than the room." Pierce blinked. "Less?" "Much less." "Really?" "Yes." The inspector looked surprised. Most people focused immediately on dramatic details. Miss Marple rarely did. She set down her teacup. "Tell me, Inspector." "Yes?" "Did Mrs. Harrow choose room 7 herself? According to the hotel owner?" "Specifically?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I should like to know why." "Because it overlooks the churchyard." "Precisely." Pierce leaned forward. "You think that's important?" "I think people often reveal themselves through preferences." "How so?" She smiled gently. "A gentleman insists upon sitting near exits because he fears embarrassment." The inspector waited. "A widow always requests a room facing the sea because it reminds her of happier days." She paused. "A nervous traveller chooses visibility." Another pause. "A guilty traveller chooses privacy." The inspector rubbed his chin. "You believe the room itself mattered." "I believe she selected it for a reason." The answer was frustratingly incomplete, yet Pierce had expected nothing else. Miss Marple's observations frequently resembled scattered puzzle pieces. Only later did they reveal their shape. That evening, another figure entered the investigation. His arrival caused considerably more excitement than Inspector Pierce's. The newcomer was Dr. Leonard Voss. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired, recently retired from a successful London practice. He had purchased a large house outside Kings Abbot 6 months earlier. Though generally respected, Dr. Voss remained something of an outsider. He attended village functions, donated generously, spoke politely, yet nobody knew him particularly well. When he heard of Violet Harrow's disappearance, he visited the police station voluntarily. Inspector Pierce received him immediately. "You have information?" "Possibly." The doctor's voice remained calm. "I knew Mrs. Harrow." The inspector sat forward. "How well?" "Moderately well." "From where?" "London." This was the first confirmed personal connection anyone had established. Pierce's interest sharpened. "When did you last see her?" "Approximately 2 months ago." "What was your relationship?" "Professional." The answer arrived a fraction too quickly. Pierce noticed. So did Finch. The inspector continued. "Medical?" "Yes." "Anything unusual?" A pause. Very brief, yet present. "Not particularly." The inspector watched him carefully. "What brought you here today, Doctor?" Voss folded his gloves. "When I learned her name, I thought I should identify myself." "That was considerate." The doctor inclined his head. "I dislike withholding information." Again, the statement sounded slightly rehearsed. Not false, merely prepared. Pierce asked several additional questions. The answers remained consistent, polite, reasonable. Yet when the doctor finally departed, Constable Finch voiced what both men were thinking. "He didn't tell us everything." "No." "You noticed too?" Pierce nodded. "I did." "What now?" The inspector gazed through the window. "We learn why." Meanwhile, events were unfolding elsewhere. At the edge of the village stood St. Jude's Church. Behind it stretched a modest churchyard containing centuries of graves. Most belonged to local families. Some had long since been forgotten. Late that afternoon, the church caretaker was trimming ivy along an old stone wall when he noticed something unusual. At first he assumed it was litter, a scrap of paper caught among wet leaves. He bent down, pulled it free, then frowned. The object was not paper. It was a torn corner of an envelope. Rain had damaged it. Mud obscured much of the writing. Yet one detail remained legible. A name. The caretaker stared, then hurried toward the vicarage. Within an hour, the fragment sat upon Inspector Pearce's desk. Constable Finch read the surviving words aloud. Harrow. Silence followed. The envelope fragment had been found directly opposite the churchyard view, visible from room 7, not far away. Perhaps 30 yards, perhaps less. Pearce studied the torn edge. Someone had ripped the envelope deliberately, not accidentally, and now part of it had appeared near the very location Violet Harrow had requested to overlook. The coincidence seemed unlikely. That night rain returned. Drops tapped gently against cottage windows throughout Kings Abbot. Miss Marple sat in her armchair with a blanket over her knees. She had heard about the envelope fragment shortly after supper. Most villagers considered it proof that Violet Harrow had reached Kings Abbot, proof that something dreadful had happened, proof that murder was involved. Miss Marple was not yet convinced. Proof was a dangerous word. Still, the fragment troubled her, particularly because it suggested intentional destruction. People destroyed letters for reasons: embarrassment, fear, secrecy, protection, or guilt. Her knitting rested forgotten in her lap. The fire crackled softly. Outside, rainwater trickled through garden paths. Inside, Miss Marple found herself returning once more to a simple question. Why had Violet Harrow wanted a room overlooking the churchyard? Not the hotel, not the village, the churchyard. That detail continued to shine like a tiny light within the darkness of the case. Small, persistent, impossible to ignore. And although she could not yet explain why, Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that somewhere among those old gravestones lay the first genuine answer. Far beyond the village, hidden from every searching eye, the truth waited patiently. But for the first time since Violet Harrow vanished, someone had begun walking in the correct direction. Chapter 3. A Name Beneath the Moss. Sunday arrived beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. The rain had finally ceased, though the village remained damp from several days of autumn weather. Water clung to hedges. Fallen leaves plastered themselves against stone walls. Smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys. By breakfast, Kings Abbot possessed a new subject for speculation: the torn envelope fragment. Several villagers had already expanded the discovery into increasingly elaborate stories. According to one version, Violet Harrow had been murdered beside a grave. According to another, she had come to the churchyard for a secret midnight meeting. By lunchtime, someone claimed to have seen a mysterious stranger carrying a lantern among the tombstones. The witness could not remember exactly when this had happened, or whether it had happened at all. Such details rarely interfered with village gossip. Inspector Roland Pearce ignored the rumours. Facts interested him more, and facts were proving frustratingly scarce. At 11 o'clock, he arrived at St. Jude's Church. The caretaker, Mr. Alfred Penrose, waited beside the gate. A practical man in his 70s, Penrose had maintained the church grounds for nearly 20 years. He led the inspector toward the location where the envelope fragment had been found. It was here. He pointed to a patch of damp earth near the wall. Pearce examined the area. Nothing immediately stood out. The grass had been flattened by recent rain. Leaves covered much of the ground. Yet something about the location felt deliberate. It sat directly opposite the churchyard-facing windows of the Black Swan. Room 7 was visible through bare tree branches. The inspector followed the line of sight, then paused. "What's that?" The caretaker looked. "What's what?" Pearce pointed toward the far corner of the churchyard. Partially hidden behind yew trees stood an old grave almost entirely covered in moss. The stone leaned noticeably. Few visitors would have noticed it. Something about it attracted his attention nonetheless. Perhaps because it appeared neglected even by churchyard standards. Perhaps because it occupied a surprisingly secluded position. They crossed the wet grass together. When they reached the grave, Penrose frowned. Strange. What is? I don't remember seeing it cleaned. The inspector knelt. Several patches of moss had recently been scraped away. Not entirely. Just enough to reveal portions of the inscription beneath. Someone had been examining the stone. Recently. Very recently. Pierce brushed away additional moss with his hand. Slowly, faded lettering emerged. The inscription read, Eleanor Fairchild, 1891 to 1937. Below that appeared a second line, smaller, harder to read. Pierce leaned closer, then froze. The words were faint but unmistakable. Beloved sister of Violet. For several seconds neither man spoke. The caretaker finally broke the silence. Good heavens! Pierce stared at the inscription. Violet. Not a common coincidence. Not impossible, but unlikely. Particularly under the circumstances. The inspector stood. Has anyone asked about this grave recently? Penrose thought, then nodded slowly. Actually, yes. A woman visited last month. Pierce's attention sharpened immediately. What woman? I don't know her name. Describe her. The caretaker considered. Perhaps 55. Dark coat. Well-spoken. His expression changed. Now that I think about it, yes, she asked specifically for this grave. The inspector felt a small surge of excitement. When? Early September. Did she leave a name? No. Could it have been Violet Harrow? Penrose hesitated. I couldn't swear to it. But perhaps. The possibility lingered heavily between them. If Violet Harrow had visited Kings Abbot weeks before her disappearance, then her planned arrival at the Black Swan was no casual holiday. She had returned for a purpose connected to Eleanor Fairchild. That afternoon, Inspector Pierce paid another visit to Miss Marple. She listened attentively while he described the grave. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment. Then she nodded. That makes sense. The inspector blinked. It does? Rather. I confess it makes very little sense to me. Miss Marple smiled. People rarely travel great distances to stare at churchyards. No, but they often travel to visit graves. The simplicity of the observation annoyed him slightly, because it was obvious, and because he had overlooked it. She folded her hands. Did you discover who Eleanor Fairchild was? Not yet. You should. I intend to. Miss Marple gazed toward the window. Family histories are curious things. The inspector waited. People imagine secrets vanish with time. Another pause. They don't. Her eyes drifted back toward him. They simply become quieter. The investigation into Eleanor Fairchild began immediately. Church records provided the first answers. By evening, Inspector Pierce possessed a modest collection of facts. Eleanor Fairchild had died in 1937. Age 46. Cause of death, accidental drowning. She had lived briefly in Kings Abbot, while working as a companion to an elderly widow. No husband, no children, no close relatives listed locally. The records ended there. At first glance, nothing appeared suspicious. Yet one detail caught Pierce's attention. The death certificate had been signed by a young physician. A physician named Dr. Leonard Voss. The inspector stared at the document, then looked again. The same Dr. Voss who had recently admitted knowing Violet Harrow. The same Dr. Voss who seemed reluctant to share information. The coincidence felt increasingly uncomfortable. Near sunset, Pierce drove directly to the doctor's house. The residence stood beyond the village on several acres of land. Its owner greeted him politely, though perhaps less warmly than before. I wondered when you'd return. The inspector accepted a seat in the study. Books lined every wall. A fire burned quietly. The atmosphere felt controlled, ordered, carefully maintained, much like its owner. Pierce produced the death certificate. Dr. Voss glanced at it. His expression altered immediately, only slightly, yet enough. "You knew Eleanor Fairchild." The doctor remained silent. "You certified her death." Still silence. "You neglected to mention that." At last Voss sighed. "Yes. Why?" The doctor removed his spectacles. For the first time, he appeared genuinely tired, "because I knew where the conversation would lead." "Then let's save time." Pierce leaned forward. "Lead it there." Several seconds passed. Finally the doctor spoke. "Eleanor Fairchild was Violet Harrow's sister." "I gathered as much. Very close sisters. Go on." The doctor's gaze settled upon the fire. "In 1937, Eleanor drowned in the river near Kings Abbot. Accidentally." Another pause. Longer this time. "I believed so. You believed. It was never proven otherwise." The answer landed heavily. Pierce watched him carefully. "What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Voss smiled sadly. "An excellent question." The room grew quiet. At last he said, "Violet never accepted the verdict." The inspector sat forward. "She thought her sister was murdered?" "Yes." "Did she accuse anyone?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Privately." "Who?" For the first time since the conversation began, genuine unease appeared on Leonard Voss's face. The reaction was impossible to miss. Pierce immediately understood that the answer mattered a great deal. The doctor spoke quietly. "She accused me." Silence filled the study. The fire crackled softly. Outside, evening wind brushed against the windows. Inside, Inspector Pierce felt the investigation shift beneath his feet. "You?" "Yes." "Why?" "I was the last person known to have seen Eleanor alive." The inspector absorbed this carefully. "You never mentioned any of this." "I hoped it was irrelevant." "Did you?" The doctor did not answer. After leaving the house, Pierce sat in his motor car for several minutes. The pieces were beginning to connect. Not neatly, not completely, but undeniably. Violet Harrow's sister had died in Kings Abbot 21 years earlier. Violet believed the death was murder. The attending doctor had been Leonard Voss. Now Violet herself had vanished after returning to the same village. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Yet something still felt wrong. If Violet suspected Voss for decades, why come back now? Why reserve room 7? Why visit the grave? And why send a warning letter only days before disappearing? The timing remained unexplained. Elsewhere, another person was thinking about Eleanor Fairchild, a person whose connection to the case remained hidden. In a small cottage near the edge of the village, a hand opened an old wooden box. Inside rested faded letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, memories preserved for decades. One photograph showed 2 young women standing beside a river. One smiled brightly. The other appeared more reserved. On the back someone had written, "Eleanor and Violet, summer 1936. The unseen figure stared at the image for a long time, then carefully returned it to the box. A shadow crossed the room as evening deepened. The box was locked. The key disappeared into a pocket. And somewhere within those forgotten papers lay a secret capable of explaining 2 mysteries separated by 21 years. That night, Miss Marple sat beside her bedroom window. Moonlight silvered the rooftops beyond her garden. She had learned about Eleanor Fairchild before retiring. The information troubled her, not because of what it revealed, because of what it did not. A woman spends 21 years believing her sister was murdered, then suddenly returns to the village where it happened. Why now? That question mattered. People seldom reopen old wounds without a reason. Something had changed, something recent, something powerful enough to draw Violet Harrow back after more than 2 decades. Miss Marple gazed into the darkness. The answer remained hidden. Yet she felt increasingly certain of one thing. The disappearance of Violet Harrow had not begun in 1958. It had begun in 1937. And until someone understood what happened beside the river 21 years earlier, no one would understand what had happened now. Far away, Midnight settled over Kings Abbot. The old grave of Eleanor Fairchild stood beneath silent yew trees. Rainwater glistened on the weathered stone. The moss-covered inscription watched over the churchyard, patient, forgotten, waiting, as though it had spent 21 years guarding a truth that was finally beginning to emerge. Chapter 4. The Woman on the Platform. Monday brought brighter weather. Sunlight finally appeared over Kings Abbot, illuminating the village with deceptive cheerfulness. Shopkeepers swept pavements. Gardeners emerged from cottages. The lingering dampness began to disappear from stone walls and pathways. Yet the mystery surrounding Violet Harrow only deepened. By now, even the most skeptical villagers accepted one conclusion. Violet had not chosen Kings Abbot by accident. The discovery of Eleanor Fairchild's grave had ensured that. The village was connected to her past, and her past, increasingly, appeared connected to danger. Inspector Roland Pierce spent the morning examining records connected to Eleanor Fairchild. The task proved difficult. 21 years was a long time. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Documents disappeared. Still, fragments remained. Old newspapers yielded several references to Eleanor. Nothing sensational. A church fundraiser, a gardening competition, a charity concert. The articles painted the picture of a quiet woman who had integrated comfortably into village life. One report, however, attracted Pierce's attention. It described a summer fete held only weeks before Eleanor's death. Among those listed as attendees were 3 names: Eleanor Fairchild, Dr. Leonard Voss, and a local businessman named Harold Cresswell. Pierce underlined the 3rd name. Unlike Voss, Harold Cresswell still lived in Kings Abbot. Harold Cresswell's house stood near the village green. The 72-year-old businessman received the inspector politely enough. Yet his expression tightened the moment Eleanor's name appeared, a reaction Pierce immediately noticed. "You remember her?" Cresswell adjusted his spectacles. "That was a long time ago." "You remember?" "Yes." The answer arrived reluctantly. "What was she like?" The elderly man stared toward the window. "Pleasant. Nothing more." A faint smile appeared. "Inspector, most men notice attractive women." Pierce said nothing. Cresswell sighed. "She was charming. Did you know her well?" "No." The response came too quickly. The inspector waited. Eventually Cresswell added, "Not particularly." A contradiction disguised as clarification. Pierce pressed further. "Were you friends? We moved in similar circles. Were you romantically involved?" The old man's jaw tightened. For a moment, Pierce thought he might refuse to answer. Instead, "No." Again, the answer arrived too quickly. Again, it sounded incomplete. The inspector changed direction. "Did she have enemies?" "Not that I knew." "Any disagreements?" "No." "What about Dr. Voss?" That produced another reaction. Small, but unmistakable. "What about him? Were they close?" Cresswell hesitated. "I couldn't say." The inspector leaned forward. "Couldn't? Or wouldn't?" The older man's eyes hardened. For the first time, warmth vanished entirely. "I've answered enough questions for one morning." The interview ended shortly afterward. As Pierce departed, his instincts remained unsatisfied. Harold Cresswell had concealed something. The question was whether it concerned Eleanor Fairchild's death or Violet Harrow's disappearance. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was engaged in an investigation of her own. Her methods differed considerably from official police procedure. She rarely interviewed suspects directly. Instead, she listened, observed, compared. Human behavior interested her more than statements. That afternoon she visited Mrs. Elspeth Cartwright, officially for tea, unofficially for information. Mrs. Cartwright possessed a remarkable talent for collecting village knowledge. Most of it arrived voluntarily. The rest seemed to arrive by surrender. As expected, the conversation soon reached the current mystery. "I always distrusted Harold Cresswell," Mrs. Cartwright declared. Miss Marple smiled. Why? He never looks comfortable. Many people aren't, especially when they have something to hide. Miss Marple stirred her tea. What sort of thing? Mrs. Cartwright lowered her voice dramatically. A romance. A recent one. No. Then perhaps not very relevant. Oh, I think it is. Miss Marple stirred her tea. After a few moments, Mrs. Cartwright continued. There were rumours. What rumours? Years ago. About Harold? About Harold and Eleanor Fairchild. The room became quiet. Miss Marple placed her cup down carefully. What sort of rumours? A courtship. That was interesting. Mrs. Cartwright nodded emphatically. Nothing official. But people talked. People always talk. Quite. The older woman leaned closer. Yet there was another rumour. Miss Marple remained silent. That Eleanor was interested in someone else. Who? Mrs. Cartwright paused, then spoke the name quietly. Dr. Voss. Elsewhere, Inspector Pearce received unexpected news. The call came from a railway employee in London. A development finally connected Violet Harrow directly to Kings Abbot. The inspector listened carefully, then immediately requested written confirmation. The facts were straightforward. A station porter remembered Violet. Not because of her appearance, because of her luggage. She carried a distinctive dark green suitcase with brass corners. The porter had helped her board a train bound toward Kings Abbot. More importantly, a second witness now existed, a ticket collector. According to his statement, Violet Harrow had indeed arrived at Kings Abbot station, on schedule. On the afternoon she disappeared. Pearce stared at the report. At last, a confirmed sighting. Violet had reached the village. The mystery was no longer whether she arrived. The mystery was what happened afterward. The news spread rapidly. By evening, villagers were discussing a new question. Who had seen Violet after she stepped off the train? Inspector Pearce organised inquiries immediately. Several people remembered passengers arriving that day. Most remembered nothing useful. Then, shortly before sunset, a breakthrough occurred. A local taxi driver came forward. His name was Frederick Ames. He operated one of only 2 taxis in the area. When shown Violet's photograph, he nodded instantly. Yes. The inspector sat forward. You're certain? Quite certain. When did you see her? The day she arrived. A surge of anticipation passed through the room. What happened? The driver frowned. That's the strange part. Go on. She hired my taxi. To the hotel? No. The answer startled everyone. Where then? Ames scratched his chin. She asked to be taken to the river. Silence followed. Pearce spoke carefully. The river? Yes. Which part? The old footbridge near Mill Lane. The inspector felt a chill of recognition. The river. The very river where Eleanor Fairchild had drowned, 21 years earlier. The taxi driver continued. She seemed nervous. In what way? Kept looking behind her. Afraid, perhaps, the driver considered, or expecting someone. Did she say anything? Very little. What exactly? Ames closed his eyes briefly, trying to remember. Then, she asked whether the river had changed. Pearce stared. What did you tell her? I said rivers don't change much. The driver shook his head. Funny thing to ask. The inspector agreed. Very funny indeed. What happened when you arrived? She got out. And then she walked toward the bridge. Alone? At first. The room became still. Pearce's voice sharpened. At first. Ames nodded. Someone was waiting there. For several seconds nobody moved. The inspector's attention locked entirely upon the driver. A man? I think so. You think? He was standing under trees. Could you see his face? No. What about his build? Ames frowned. Average height. Young? Older? Anything else? The driver thought, then shook his head. But no. Disappointment flickered across Pearce's face. Still, the information mattered enormously. Someone had arranged to meet Violet at the river. Someone she apparently expected. Someone who remained unidentified. What happened next? They spoke. Could you hear them? No. How long? Less than a minute. And then? They walked away together. Toward where? The driver pointed generally north, along the river path. Pierce exchanged a glance with Constable Finch. That path eventually led toward open countryside and several isolated properties, including one rather familiar house, the residence of Dr. Leonard Voss. That evening, as darkness settled over Kings Abbot, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden. The final roses of the season nodded gently in the breeze. She had already heard about the taxi driver's statement. Everyone had. The village hummed with speculation. Yet Miss Marple found herself interested in a different detail. Not the meeting, not the river, the question Violet had asked. Has the river changed? Such a peculiar thing to say. Unless one was comparing it to memory, the remark suggested familiarity, emotion, perhaps even grief. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. A woman returns after 21 years, visits her sister's grave, requests a room overlooking the churchyard, travels directly to the river where that sister died, meets someone waiting in secret. The pattern was becoming visible, yet one element remained missing. The reason. What had brought Violet back now? What had she discovered? Because Miss Marple increasingly suspected that Violet had not returned merely to remember the past. She had returned because she had learned something new about it, something powerful enough to disturb old certainties, something dangerous enough to make her send a warning letter before leaving London. Far across the village, hidden inside a locked drawer, an old packet of letters waited silently. Letters written decades earlier. Letters that had never reached their intended recipient. Letters capable of changing everything. And before many more days passed, those letters would emerge from the shadows and place nearly every suspect in a very different light. Chapter 5. The Letters That Never Arrived. Tuesday morning arrived with a sharp wind from the north. The weather had changed overnight. Leaves skittered across village lanes. Clouds raced above the church spire. The brief warmth of the previous day had vanished completely. Kings Abbot woke to a feeling that something significant was approaching. No one could have explained why. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of unanswered questions. Or perhaps human beings possess a natural instinct for gathering storms. Inspector Roland Pierce began the day with an unpleasant realization. The investigation was expanding faster than the evidence. Every answer seemed to produce 3 additional questions. Violet Harrow had arrived in Kings Abbot. That much was now certain. She had travelled to the river. She had met someone. After that, her movements vanished completely. No witnesses, no luggage, no body, nothing. The absence troubled him. People did not simply disappear, not without assistance. His first visitor that morning was unexpected, the church caretaker, Alfred Penrose. The elderly man entered the station carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found something." Pierce immediately sat up. "Where?" "The church." "Near the grave?" "No." Penrose placed the parcel on the desk. It was hidden inside a loose stone in the vestry wall. The inspector frowned. "How did you discover it?" "I was repairing water damage." He hesitated. "At first I thought it was rubbish." Carefully he unwrapped the package. Inside lay a bundle of old letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, tied together with faded blue ribbon. Pierce stared. The letters looked old, very old. The oldest appeared decades old. "What are they?" "I thought you should see." The inspector untied the ribbon. Several envelopes immediately slid free. His eyes widened. Every letter bore the same name, Miss Eleanor Fairchild. The room fell silent. An hour later, Miss Marple sat opposite Inspector Pierce in his office. The bundle rested between them. Neither had yet examined every letter. There were too many. But what they had already discovered was remarkable. Most were dated between 1935 and 1937, the final years of Eleanor Fairchild's life. More importantly, many had never been opened. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Very curious. That's one way of describing it. Pierce selected an envelope. The handwriting changes. Yes, different senders. Several. The inspector nodded. Among the names appeared friends, acquaintances, business contacts, and one especially familiar correspondent, Dr. Leonard Voss. That discovery alone had transformed the significance of the letters. Miss Marple examined an unopened envelope. Someone hid these deliberately. Agreed. People don't conceal ordinary correspondence inside church walls. No, her gaze drifted toward the window, and they don't prevent letters from reaching their recipient without reason. The implication hung between them. Somebody had intercepted Eleanor Fairchild's mail, repeatedly, systematically, over a considerable period. The question was why. By midday, Dr. Leonard Voss received another visit from the police. This time he looked genuinely troubled when Pierce revealed the discovery. Letters. Quite a collection. The doctor's expression darkened. Addressed to Eleanor? Yes. For several moments he said nothing. Then, "May I see them?" Pierce studied him carefully. Perhaps later. The answer disappointed him. Not because it was unexpected, because it delayed a conversation he had apparently hoped to avoid. "You recognize the handwriting?" "Some of it." "Yours included?" Voss nodded. "I wrote to her." "Frequently?" The doctor hesitated, then answered honestly. "Yes." "How frequently?" "Several times each month." The inspector leaned back. "That sounds more than casual friendship." A shadow crossed the doctor's face. Perhaps it was. The admission arrived quietly, without drama, yet it altered everything. Pierce spoke carefully. "You loved her." Dr. Voss did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice sounded older somehow, very much. For a moment neither man spoke. The confession seemed to exhaust him. Years appeared to settle upon his shoulders. "Did she return your feelings?" Pierce asked. A faint smile appeared, sad rather than happy. "Yes." The inspector absorbed this. "You intended to marry?" "We discussed it." "Then why didn't you?" The smile vanished. "Because she died." A simple answer, a devastating one. Pierce studied him carefully. "You never mentioned any of this." "No. Why?" The doctor walked slowly toward the window. Outside, wind moved through bare branches. "Because people always assume the same thing." "What thing?" "That love provides motive." The inspector could not deny it. Dr. Voss continued. "When Eleanor died, there were whispers. About you." "Yes. Because you were the last person to see her alive." The doctor nodded. "And because people enjoy tragedy." His voice carried bitterness now. Old bitterness. The kind that survives decades. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor. Harold Cresswell. The elderly businessman rarely called unexpectedly. His appearance alone suggested significance. She welcomed him into the sitting room. Tea was served. Polite conversation followed. For nearly 10 minutes neither mentioned the investigation. Finally Cresswell sighed. "I imagine you've heard about the letters." "Yes." "I thought you might." Miss Marple waited. The older man stared into his teacup, then said, "I should have spoken sooner." Her expression remained gentle. "About Eleanor." "Yes." Silence followed. At last he continued. "I cared for her." Miss Marple nodded. "I suspected as much." A brief smile touched his face. "Everyone suspected." "Perhaps. She never loved me." The words emerged without resentment, only resignation. "I knew that." Miss Marple said nothing. She loved Leonard. Again silence. Then, "I was foolish enough to hope she would change her mind." The confession seemed to lighten him slightly, like a burden finally set down. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked softly. His gaze drifted toward the fire. "I wish I knew." The conversation lasted another hour. By its conclusion, Miss Marple possessed several important facts. Eleanor and Leonard Voss had indeed planned a future together. Their relationship was known only to a small circle. Harold Cresswell had been among those aware of it. More interesting still, several weeks before Eleanor's death, she had become increasingly anxious, not frightened, preoccupied, as though waiting for something, or someone. The description immediately reminded Miss Marple of another woman, Violet Harrow, 21 years later, sending warning letters, looking over her shoulder, expecting danger. The similarity was difficult to ignore. Near sunset, the case took another dramatic turn. Two boys exploring near the river discovered something buried beneath tangled roots. At first they assumed it was rubbish, then one noticed brass fittings. The police arrived shortly afterward. Inspector Pierce personally supervised the excavation. Within minutes the object emerged fully. A suitcase, dark green, brass corners, the same luggage described by the station porter, the same luggage carried by Violet Harrow when she arrived in Kings Abbot. For several seconds nobody spoke. The discovery felt almost unreal. At last, physical evidence. Pierce knelt beside it. The suitcase was damaged, water-stained, partially buried, yet unmistakably Violet's. "Open it." Constable Finch carefully forced the lock. The lid creaked, then lifted. Everyone stared. The contents remained largely intact. Clothing, toiletries, personal belongings. Nothing immediately extraordinary, until Finch discovered a false compartment beneath the lining. The inspector leaned forward. Inside rested a single envelope, sealed, protected from moisture, addressed in Violet Harrow's handwriting. The envelope bore only 3 words: "If anything happens, silence settled over the riverbank." Even the wind seemed to pause. Pierce carefully removed the envelope. His pulse quickened. At last, perhaps the missing explanation, perhaps the reason Violet had returned, perhaps the identity of the person she feared. Slowly he broke the seal. Inside lay several folded pages and a photograph. The inspector unfolded the letter first. His eyes moved across the opening lines, then abruptly stopped. For the first time since the investigation began, genuine shock appeared on his face. Constable Finch noticed immediately. "What is it?" Pierce looked up. The colour had drained from his features. "What does it say?" Several seconds passed before the inspector answered. When he did, his voice sounded almost disbelieving. "It says Eleanor Fairchild did not drown accidentally." The river seemed suddenly very quiet. Finch stared. "What?" Pierce looked down at the page again, then read aloud. "I have finally learned the truth about my sister's death. The person responsible is still alive." The words echoed through the gathering dusk. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The implication struck every listener simultaneously. Violet Harrow had returned to Kings Abbot because she believed she had solved a 21-year-old murder, and now she herself had vanished. That night, Miss Marple sat awake long after midnight. The discovery of the suitcase had changed everything. No longer was the investigation centered on a disappearance. The letter transformed the entire case. If Violet had indeed uncovered proof of murder, then motive suddenly existed. Powerful motive, immediate motive, deadly motive. Yet Miss Marple found herself dwelling on something else. Not the accusation, not even the hidden letter, the photograph. Inspector Pierce had mentioned it only briefly. A photograph enclosed with Violet's note, an old photograph, taken shortly before Eleanor's death. And according to the inspector, one detail in the image seemed strangely important, a detail no one yet understood. Miss Marple stared into the darkness. Human beings, she reflected, often notice important things without recognizing their importance. A gesture, a glance, a misplaced object, a forgotten promise. The photograph would matter, she felt certain of it, and somewhere within that image lay a clue capable of exposing not only what happened in 1937, But what had happened to Violet Harrow in 1958? Outside, moonlight silvered the river where Eleanor Fairchild had died, or perhaps been killed. The water flowed onward, indifferent to human secrets. Yet secrets, Miss Marple knew, possess a habit of resurfacing, no matter how deeply they are buried, no matter how many years pass. And now, after 21 years, one of those secrets had begun to emerge. Chapter 6. The photograph in the envelope. Wednesday dawned cold and brilliantly clear. For the first time in days there was no mist over the fields, no rain threatening from the horizon. The sky stretched blue above Kings Abbot, and sunlight glittered on the river like fragments of broken glass. The weather seemed almost inappropriate. A village could hardly enjoy such a beautiful morning while contemplating murder. Yet murder was precisely what many people were now discussing. Not officially, not yet. But Violet Harrow's letter had changed the atmosphere entirely. A missing woman was one thing. A missing woman who claimed to have uncovered a killer was something else altogether. Inspector Roland Pierce arrived at the station shortly after 7. The first item waiting on his desk was Violet Harrow's letter. He had read it 3 times already. Now he read it again. Each reading produced new questions. The document consisted of 4 closely written pages. Violet's handwriting remained neat throughout, though occasional irregularities suggested strain or fear. The opening section explained why she had returned to Kings Abbot. For years, she had believed Eleanor's death had been murder. For years, she possessed no proof. Then, several months earlier, she had discovered something among her late mother's possessions. A collection of documents, old correspondence, personal notes, and one particular item, a diary fragment written by Eleanor shortly before her death. The fragment itself was not included. According to Violet, it had disappeared shortly after she found it, a fact she considered highly suspicious. The letter continued. The missing pages contained references to meetings Eleanor held in secret during the summer of 1937. She wrote that she had learned something capable of ruining a respected person. She did not name the individual, but she clearly feared the consequences. Pierce leaned back. A respected person. That description could apply to numerous individuals, especially over 2 decades. He continued reading. I now believe my sister was killed because of what she discovered. More importantly, I believe the person responsible realized she had written about it. The inspector rubbed his eyes. That sentence troubled him greatly. If true, it suggested premeditation. Not accident, not impulse, deliberate murder. The final section concerned the photograph. Pierce lifted it from the desk. It was a black and white image, slightly faded, taken during the summer of 1937. 4 people stood beside the river near Mill Lane. Eleanor Fairchild, Dr. Leonard Voss, Harold Cresswell, and a 4th individual, a woman. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable. Yet Violet had devoted nearly an entire page of her letter to the photograph, specifically to the 4th person. The woman was identified as Margaret Bellamy, a schoolteacher who had lived briefly in Kings Abbot before leaving unexpectedly in 1938. According to Violet, Margaret possessed information about Eleanor's final weeks, information that had never been shared publicly. The inspector studied the image. Margaret Bellamy appeared ordinary enough. Dark hair, serious expression, perhaps 30 years old. The sort of face one forgets quickly. And yet Violet clearly considered her important, very important. The difficulty was obvious. Margaret Bellamy had vanished from Kings Abbot nearly 20 years earlier. Finding her would not be easy. Around mid-morning, Miss Marple arrived at the police station. The inspector showed her the photograph. She examined it carefully, far more carefully than he expected. Several minutes passed. Interesting. Pierce smiled faintly. You found something, perhaps. What? Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Not what is present. The inspector sighed. Then what? What is absent? A familiar response, and no less frustrating than usual. She pointed toward Eleanor. Notice her expression. Pierce looked. Eleanor appeared pleasant, relaxed, entirely normal. I see nothing unusual. Exactly. Miss Marple nodded. Nor do I. The inspector stared. That helps us how? She smiled gently. If Eleanor feared someone, it was not yet visible. Pierce rubbed his forehead. You always make simple things sound mysterious. Only because human beings are mysterious. The morning's most significant development arrived unexpectedly. A retired postmistress named Agnes Holloway requested an interview. She was 81 years old, sharp-eyed, remarkably observant, and possessed an excellent memory. The moment she entered the station, Pierce sensed importance. You have information? Possibly. The elderly woman settled into a chair. I saw the photograph in the newspaper. Yes? I recognized Margaret Bellamy. The inspector leaned forward. You knew her? Quite well. Excitement flickered across his face. What can you tell us? Agnes considered. Margaret wasn't merely a schoolteacher. No, she and Eleanor were close friends. The inspector nodded. We suspected as much. The old woman shook her head. No, you misunderstand. A pause. Then they were inseparable. Over the next 20 minutes, Agnes revealed a series of fascinating details. Margaret and Eleanor spent enormous amounts of time together during 1937. Long walks, private conversations, frequent meetings. Then, shortly before Eleanor's death, something changed. A disagreement, a serious one. No one knew the cause, but several villagers noticed it. The friendship cooled abruptly. Within months, Eleanor was dead, and shortly afterward, Margaret left Kings Abbot permanently. Did she ever return? Pierce asked. Not that I know. Where did she go? Agnes frowned. I believe Birmingham. The inspector immediately made a note. For the first time, Margaret Bellamy appeared traceable and potentially crucial. Meanwhile, events elsewhere were moving toward disaster. At approximately 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Leonard Voss left his house for a walk. He often walked after lunch. The routine was well known. The route rarely varied. Across the fields, along the river, back through the village. Normally uneventful. Today was different. At 3:30, a farm labourer discovered him. The doctor lay unconscious at the base of a steep embankment. Blood stained his forehead. His walking stick rested several yards away. The labourer immediately summoned help. Within minutes, the village was in turmoil. Inspector Pierce arrived at the scene shortly afterward. The doctor had already been transported to hospital, fortunately alive. Barely. Pierce examined the area carefully. The embankment was dangerous. A fall seemed plausible, yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. He noticed disturbed soil, scuff marks, broken vegetation, signs of struggle. Constable Finch reached the same conclusion. You think someone pushed him? Pierce nodded slowly. I do. The younger officer looked grim. Because of the investigation? Most likely. Neither man voiced the obvious implication. Someone had attempted to kill Leonard Voss, or silence him. News spread through Kings Abbot with astonishing speed. By evening, fear had replaced curiosity. This was no longer a mystery involving old events and distant tragedies. The danger was present, immediate, active. People felt it. Doors were locked earlier. Curtains were drawn sooner. Conversations became cautious. If someone had attacked Dr. Voss, then the killer was not merely protecting an old secret. The killer was still willing to act. Miss Marple visited the hospital shortly before sunset. The doctor had regained consciousness. Though weak, he remained alert. He greeted her with a faint smile. I suspected you'd come. I was concerned. How kind. The smile faded. For a moment his expression grew thoughtful, then troubled. Miss Marple. Yes? I remembered something. She waited. The doctor stared toward the window. I should have remembered sooner. What? A long silence followed. Then, The night before Eleanor died, Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. What about it? I saw her arguing. With whom? Another pause. The doctor's face tightened. Clearly the memory disturbed him. At last he answered. I couldn't see the person's face. Disappointment flickered briefly, then vanished. He continued. But I remember one thing. What? The voice. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. The doctor swallowed. The person was a woman. The revelation altered everything. Until now, nearly every theory had centered upon men. Harold Cresswell, Leonard Voss, unknown male suspects. The assumption had become almost automatic. Now that assumption collapsed. A woman had argued with Eleanor shortly before her death. A woman connected somehow to the events of 1937. A woman who might also be connected to Violet Harrow's disappearance. Miss Marple left the hospital deep in thought. The evening air had grown cold. Stars appeared above the village. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a curtain shifted. As curious eyes watched her pass, she barely noticed. Her thoughts remained fixed upon a single name. Margaret Bellamy. Friend. Confidant. Witness. Perhaps more. The schoolteacher had disappeared from Kings Abbot after Eleanor's death, and now, decades later, her name had resurfaced at precisely the moment someone attempted to kill Dr. Voss. Coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. Near midnight, Inspector Pierce sat alone in his office. Several documents lay spread across his desk. The photograph, Violet's letter, statements from witnesses, hospital reports. The pieces refused to fit neatly together. Yet one pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Eleanor Fairchild, Margaret Bellamy, Leonard Voss, Harold Cresswell, and now Violet Harrow. 5 lives, all connected to a death beside the river in 1937. The inspector stared at the photograph once more. Then something caught his eye. A detail so small he had overlooked it repeatedly. His gaze narrowed. He lifted the picture closer to the lamp. There, just visible in the background, partially obscured by trees, a figure, someone watching the group from a distance. Not one of the 4 subjects, a 5th person, almost hidden, almost forgotten, but unmistakably present. And for the first time since the investigation began, Inspector Pierce felt he was looking directly at the shadow of a killer. Chapter 7. The 5th Figure. Thursday morning began with urgency. For the first time since Violet Harrow's disappearance, Inspector Roland Pierce felt that the investigation had a clear direction. Not a solution, not yet, but a direction. The blurred figure hidden in the background of the photograph represented something tangible. A person, a witness, perhaps even a suspect. Most importantly, it represented something that could be pursued. After days spent chasing shadows, that alone felt like progress. The photograph was delivered immediately to specialists in London. Unfortunately, photographic enhancement in 1958 was hardly miraculous. The experts could enlarge the image. They could sharpen certain details, but they could not create information that did not exist. By mid-morning, their preliminary assessment arrived. The results were disappointing. The figure appeared female. Beyond that, little could be determined. Average height, dark clothing, possibly wearing a hat. No facial features could be distinguished. No identifying marks. Nothing conclusive. Inspector Pierce stared at the report. A woman. Another woman. The pattern continued. 24 hours earlier, Dr. Leonard Voss had remembered hearing a woman arguing with Eleanor shortly before her death. Now the mysterious observer in the photograph also appeared to be female. Coincidence remained possible, but increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, Miss Marple spent the morning pursuing a very different line of inquiry. Instead of studying photographs, she visited the village library. The librarian, Mrs. Pritchard, greeted her warmly. Few people used the local archive room. Fewer still used it effectively. Miss Marple happened to be one of them. She spent nearly 2 hours examining old newspapers, church newsletters, village bulletins, community records. At first glance, the material appeared unrelated. Garden competitions, fundraising drives, school concerts. Yet human beings frequently revealed themselves in the most mundane places. Eventually, she found what she was seeking, a report from June 1937, a brief article describing a charity committee. Among the members listed were Eleanor Fairchild, Margaret Bellamy, Harold Cresswell, and another woman, a woman whose name had appeared nowhere in the current investigation, Beatrice Morrow. Miss Marple read the article twice, then a third time. The name stirred something faintly familiar. Not memory exactly, more a sense of recognition, a thread connecting distant observations. She copied the article carefully, then continued searching. An hour later, she found Beatrice Morrow's name again, and this time she smiled, very faintly, very thoughtfully. Elsewhere, Inspector Pierce received unexpected visitors. A husband and wife from a neighbouring village, Thomas and Ruth Ellison. Both elderly, both visibly nervous. The couple requested privacy. Once seated, Thomas cleared his throat. "We heard about the photograph." The inspector nodded. "Yes?" The older man exchanged a glance with his wife, then said, "We think we know who the woman might be." The room became still. Pierce leaned forward. "Go on." Ruth Ellison clasped her hands tightly. "I saw her once." "When?" "Years ago." "How many years?" 21. The inspector's pulse quickened. "Tell me." The elderly woman took a breath. "The evening Eleanor Fairchild died." Silence followed. Even Constable Finch stopped writing. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The account emerged slowly. Memory is a fragile thing, particularly after 2 decades. Yet certain moments remain vivid. According to Ruth Ellison, she and her husband had been walking home near dusk on the evening of Eleanor's death. As they approached the river path, they noticed a woman standing among the trees, watching, not walking, not resting, watching. At the time it seemed odd, nothing more. Then they heard raised voices farther along the riverbank, a man and a woman, arguing. The sounds carried across the water, not clearly enough to understand words, clearly enough to recognize anger. "We didn't investigate," Thomas admitted. "We minded our own business." The inspector nodded. "Reasonable. Human." "What happened next?" The couple exchanged another glance. Then Ruth answered quietly. The woman watching the argument left. Toward the voices? No. Away from them. That detail immediately interested Pierce. "Can you describe her?" The old woman frowned. "Not very well. Anything helps." A long pause followed. Then, "She limped." The inspector stared. "What?" "A slight limp." The elderly woman nodded. "I remember because it seemed unusual. A limp, a distinctive characteristic. At last, something concrete." That afternoon brought another development. A response arrived from Birmingham. Police there had traced records connected to Margaret Bellamy. The former schoolteacher had indeed relocated after leaving Kings Abbot. She had worked briefly in several schools, then disappeared from official records entirely. No death certificate, no marriage registration, no forwarding address, nothing. It was as though she had deliberately vanished. Inspector Pierce read the report twice, then frowned. Ordinary people leave traces, taxes, employment records, correspondence. Margaret Bellamy seemed determined not to. That fact alone elevated her importance considerably. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Miss Marple requested a meeting with the inspector. She arrived carrying a folder, and wearing the expression she reserved for particularly interesting discoveries. Pierce immediately recognized it. "What have you found?" Miss Marple settled comfortably into a chair, possibly a great deal. The inspector waited. She handed him the copied newspaper article. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. Beatrice Morrow? Yes. You think she's important? I do. Why? Miss Marple folded her hands. Because nobody has mentioned her. The inspector blinked. That's what makes her important? Frequently. He sighed. Please explain. She smiled gently. In village life, people discuss rivals. A pause. They discuss friends. Another pause. They discuss romances. The inspector nodded. Naturally. Yet no one has mentioned Beatrice Morrow. Perhaps she wasn't significant. Miss Marple shook her head. She served on committees with Eleanor. That proves little. Not by itself. She reached into her handbag, then produced a second clipping. This one dated several months later. Pierce examined it. His eyebrows rose immediately. The article announced a resignation. Beatrice Morrow had abruptly left several community organizations, only weeks after Eleanor's death. No explanation provided. No farewell gathering. No public statement. Simply gone. The timing was remarkable. The inspector studied the article carefully. What happened to her? That, said Miss Marple, is exactly the correct question. Do you know the answer? I know where she went. Pierce sat upright. You found her? Not exactly. The faint smile returned. But I found her sister. An hour later they travelled together to a neighbouring town. The journey lasted 40 minutes. Their destination was a modest terraced house occupied by Mrs. Edith Langley, age 68, widowed, retired, and, most importantly, sister of Beatrice Morrow. The elderly woman welcomed them cautiously. The moment Beatrice's name was mentioned, however, her expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, something closer to sadness, a very old sadness. You're asking about B? Yes, said Pierce. Why? The woman looked toward the fireplace. For several moments she remained silent. Then, I wondered if this day would come. The inspector's attention sharpened immediately. What do you mean? Mrs. Langley sighed. My sister spent years waiting. Waiting for what? The truth. The room fell silent. Miss Marple and the inspector exchanged a glance. The phrase sounded painfully familiar. Violet Harrow had spent years waiting for truth. Apparently she was not alone. The conversation continued, slowly, carefully, the way conversations often do when approaching painful memories. Eventually, Mrs. Langley revealed a remarkable fact. In 1937, Beatrice Morrow had been engaged to marry a local solicitor, a respectable man, well-regarded, popular. His name had never appeared during the investigation. Yet the moment Mrs. Langley spoke it, both visitors felt the significance. The name was Arthur Bell, the same solicitor who handled several legal affairs connected to Eleanor Fairchild's employer, the same solicitor whose office records had mysteriously disappeared during the war, a connection nobody had previously recognized. Did your sister know Eleanor? Miss Marple asked. The older woman nodded. Very well. Were they friends? A hesitation. Then, no. That answer surprised everyone. Not friends? No. The woman's expression hardened slightly. They disliked each other. The revelation landed like a stone, dropped into still water. Neither Pierce nor Miss Marple interrupted. Mrs. Langley continued quietly. Beatrice believed Eleanor had discovered something. What? I don't know. Did she ever say? No. The woman stared into the distance. But she was frightened. The inspector felt his pulse quicken. Another frightened woman. Another secret. Another warning. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. As dusk settled over the countryside, Miss Marple and Inspector Pierce returned to Kings Abbot. Neither spoke for much of the journey. Each was occupied with thoughts of Beatrice Morrow, the forgotten woman, the woman nobody mentioned, the woman who vanished from village life after Eleanor's death, the woman whose sister spoke of fear. At last, Miss Marple broke the silence. Inspector, yes? How many women are connected to this case now? He considered. Eleanor, yes. Violet, indeed. Margaret Bellamy, quite. Beatrice Morrow. Miss Marple nodded. And? The inspector frowned. And what? She gazed out the window. The woman Dr. Voss heard arguing. A pause. The woman in the photograph. Another pause. The woman seen watching from the trees. The inspector felt a curious sensation, as though a hidden shape was beginning to emerge from darkness. A pattern, a structure, something overlooked. For too long, everyone had searched for a male killer, a male suspect, a male secret. Yet the case seemed increasingly populated by women. Women connected through fear, through knowledge, through silence, through something that began in 1937, something that had reached forward through 21 years to claim Violet Harrow as well. Late that night, a telephone rang inside the police station. Constable Finch answered. His expression changed immediately. Within moments, Inspector Pearce was summoned. The message came from Birmingham. Urgent, unexpected, and profoundly alarming. After years of searching records, inquiries, and archives, someone had finally located Margaret Bellamy, alive, living under another name, in a small coastal town. The good news lasted only seconds, because the second half of the message was far worse. Margaret Bellamy had disappeared 2 days earlier, without explanation, without warning, and from the evidence left behind, local police believed someone had entered her house shortly before she vanished. The inspector slowly lowered the receiver. The room felt suddenly colder. 21 years after Eleanor Fairchild's death, weeks after Violet Harrow returned seeking answers. Now Margaret Bellamy was gone as well, and for the first time, the possibility became impossible to ignore. Someone was systematically removing people connected to the truth. Chapter 8. The File No One Was Meant to See. Friday morning arrived beneath low clouds and a restless wind. The news of Margaret Bellamy's disappearance spread quickly through official circles, though the general public remained unaware of it. Inspector Roland Pearce preferred it that way. Panic rarely improved investigations. Besides, he needed facts, not speculation. Yet privately, the development disturbed him more than any previous discovery. Violet Harrow vanished after returning to Kings Abbot. Dr. Leonard Voss narrowly survived an apparent attack. Now Margaret Bellamy had disappeared within days of being identified. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Someone was protecting a secret, and doing so with increasing desperation. At 10 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived unexpectedly at the police station. She carried no folder, no newspaper clippings, no notes. That alone interested the inspector. Miss Marple generally arrived with evidence when she wanted to prove something. She arrived empty-handed when she wanted someone else to think. "Good morning, Miss Marple." She sat comfortably, then folded her hands. "I believe we've been asking the wrong question." Pearce sighed. A familiar beginning. What should we be asking? Not who killed Eleanor. The inspector blinked. No? No. Why not? Because that assumes Eleanor herself was the target. The room grew still. Pearce stared at her. For several moments he said nothing. Then, "You think someone else was the target?" "Possibly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or perhaps something else." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "You'll need to explain." "I shall try." She settled deeper into the chair. Eleanor discovered information. Agreed. Information important enough to frighten her. Yes. And important enough to frighten Beatrice Morrow. Apparently. Miss Marple nodded. And important enough for Violet Harrow to spend 21 years searching for answers. The inspector remained silent. The pattern was obvious. The conclusion was not. "What sort of information survives for 21 years?" Miss Marple asked softly. "A scandal, perhaps. A crime, possibly." She shook her head. "But not an ordinary one." The inspector frowned. "No, no." Her eyes met his. "People will kill for love." A pause. "They will kill for money." Another pause. "They will even kill to protect reputation." She leaned forward slightly. "But very few secrets remain dangerous for 21 years, unless they threaten identity itself." The sentence lingered. Identity. The word struck him unexpectedly. Shortly after noon, a breakthrough arrived from an entirely different direction. A retired clerk named Walter Green requested an interview. The man had once worked for Arthur Bell's solicitor's office. The same Arthur Bell connected to Beatrice Morrow. The same Arthur Bell whose records had largely disappeared. Green was 83, frail, precise, and carrying a small metal box. I found this during a house clearance. He placed the box on the desk. It belonged to Mr. Bell. Inspector Pierce immediately opened it. Inside rested several papers. Most appeared routine. Old accounts, receipts, property documents, nothing remarkable. Then he discovered a file, thin, unmarked, hidden beneath a false bottom. His pulse quickened. Carefully he unfolded the contents. The first page contained only a list of names: Eleanor Fairchild, Margaret Bellamy, Beatrice Morrow, Harold Cresswell, Leonard Voss, and one final name, a name that appeared nowhere else in the investigation: Rose Ellingworth. Pierce stared. The name meant nothing, yet its presence clearly mattered. The second document proved even more startling. It was a handwritten memorandum, undated, unsigned, clearly intended for private reference. The inspector read silently, then read again. Constable Finch watched his expression change. "What is it?" Pierce looked up slowly. "Good God. What?" The inspector handed him the page. Finch began reading. Within seconds, he understood. The memorandum referred repeatedly to a child. A young girl, no name given, only initials. The document described efforts to conceal her parentage, arrangements, payments, legal protections, discreet transfers of money. Every line suggested the same thing: a scandal, a potentially devastating scandal, and one involving powerful people. The final paragraph was the most alarming. Should Miss Fairchild proceed with her threatened disclosures, immediate action will be necessary to prevent irreparable consequences. The room became very quiet. Neither officer spoke. The meaning seemed obvious. Eleanor Fairchild had threatened to reveal something connected to a child's identity, something important enough to generate discussions of immediate action. An hour later, Miss Marple examined the document. She read it carefully, then closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was sadness in her expression. Not surprise, sadness. "You understand it." Pierce noticed immediately. She nodded. "Part of it." "What part?" "The motive." The inspector leaned forward. "Explain." Miss Marple placed the memorandum on the desk. "In villages, Inspector, people often pretend the past has disappeared." A pause. "It hasn't." Another pause. "Particularly where children are concerned." The inspector waited. "You think this concerns illegitimacy?" "Possibly. That seems insufficient motive for murder. Today, perhaps." Her voice remained gentle, but not in 1937. The inspector could not argue. A revelation capable of destroying families, careers, reputations, and social standing might indeed provoke desperate actions, especially in that era. That afternoon, another discovery emerged, one hidden within Arthur Bell's surviving papers, a photograph, different from the one found in Violet's suitcase, older, more formal, taken around 1920. Several adults stood beside a large country house. One woman held a small child. At first glance, the image appeared unimportant. Then Miss Marple noticed something: the child's face, specifically the eyes. She requested a magnifying glass. Several minutes passed. Nobody interrupted. Finally, she lowered the photograph, then looked at Inspector Pierce. "Do you know Rose Ellingworth?" "No. I think we must find her." By evening, inquiries produced results. Rose Ellingworth was not dead, nor had she left England. She lived quietly in Surrey. Age 43, widowed, respectable, entirely ordinary. Yet one detail immediately caught the inspector's attention: her age, 43. meaning she had been approximately 22 in 1937, old enough to be connected to the events, young enough to fit certain possibilities. A visit was arranged immediately. The journey to Surrey occupied most of the evening. Rose Ellingworth received them politely. She appeared composed, self-possessed, intelligent, the sort of woman accustomed to controlling her emotions. Everything changed when Eleanor Fairchild's name was mentioned. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed her face. A very brief reaction, yet unmistakable. You knew her. Rose sat slowly. Long ago. How long ago? Before the war. Miss Marple watched quietly. The older woman folded her hands. A small gesture, yet revealing. People often did that when preparing themselves for unpleasant conversations. What happened to Eleanor? Rose asked. The question itself was revealing. Not what happened to Violet. Not why police were asking questions. What happened to Eleanor, as though the matter had troubled her for years. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. By its conclusion, the shape of the mystery had changed dramatically. Rose eventually admitted several crucial facts. She had known Eleanor, Margaret Bellamy, and Beatrice Morrow. All 4 women belonged to the same social circle during the 1930s. More importantly, they shared a secret. A very large secret. One Rose had protected for decades. The inspector listened carefully. At last he asked, "What was the secret?" Rose closed her eyes. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then she answered quietly, "The child." Again the child. Again the same mysterious reference. The inspector felt his pulse quicken. What child? Rose opened her eyes. Fear appeared there. Real fear. Not fear of police. Not fear of exposure. Fear of memory. The sort that survives for decades. She wasn't supposed to exist. Silence filled the room. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Rose continued. Everything began with her. The explanation that followed was incomplete, fragmented, painful, yet one fact emerged clearly. In 1937, Eleanor Fairchild learned the truth about a young woman's identity, a truth concealed since childhood. The revelation implicated several respected individuals, including at least one person still alive, possibly more. Before Rose could reveal the entire story, however, she stopped. Abruptly. Her expression changed, the color drained from her face. She was staring toward the window. Nobody understood why. Then Miss Marple turned. A figure stood outside in the darkness, watching the house. Motionless, silent, gone almost immediately. By the time Inspector Pierce reached the door, the person had vanished. But the message was unmistakable. Someone knew Rose had spoken. Someone was still watching. The return journey to Kings Abbot took place in near silence. Each passenger remained occupied with private thoughts. At last Miss Marple spoke. "Inspector." "Yes?" "I believe we are very close now." Pierce looked at her. "You know who did it?" "Not yet." "Then what do you know?" She gazed through the window into the darkness. "I know why." The answer carried enormous weight, because motive had always been the missing piece. Not inheritance, not romance, not blackmail. Something older. Something more personal. Something rooted in identity, in family, in a child whose existence threatened powerful people. Just after midnight, another message arrived. This one from Birmingham. Police had searched Margaret Bellamy's abandoned residence more thoroughly. A hidden compartment had been discovered beneath a bedroom floorboard. Inside lay a diary. Not Margaret's, Eleanor Fairchild's. The missing diary. The very diary Violet Harrow had described in her letter. The document was being transported immediately to Kings Abbot. Inspector Pierce stared at the telegram, then slowly folded it. At last, the voice of the dead woman herself. And if Eleanor had truly recorded what she learned in 1937, then the mystery was about to enter its most dangerous phase, because somewhere inside those pages lay the secret people had been willing to kill for. not once, but twice. Chapter 9. Eleanor's Last Truth. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over Kings Abbot like approaching thunder. The village itself remained unaware of the latest developments. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Children played in the square. Farmers discussed weather and harvest yields. Life continued. Yet inside the police station, everyone understood that the investigation had reached a critical point. The diary had arrived shortly before dawn, and Eleanor Fairchild, silent for 21 years, was finally about to speak. Inspector Roland Pierce unlocked the evidence room personally. The diary rested on the table where it had been placed during the night. It was smaller than he expected, bound in faded blue leather, its edges worn from handling. A perfectly ordinary object. Yet several people had disappeared, lied, or nearly died because of what it contained. That fact alone gave it weight. Miss Marple arrived shortly afterward. Neither spoke much. There was little to say. The moment belonged to Eleanor. Pierce carefully opened the first page. The early entries proved mundane. Village activities, books she had read, conversations, daily concerns, nothing unusual. Then, gradually, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, more guarded, more anxious. And finally, in June of 1937, Eleanor began writing about a discovery she clearly struggled to understand. The relevant passages occupied nearly 20 pages. Inspector Pierce read them aloud. At first, the details appeared confusing. Names were omitted. References remained indirect. Eleanor clearly feared someone might read her diary. Yet the overall picture slowly emerged. 22 years earlier, around 1915, a child had been born under circumstances considered scandalous. The child's biological mother belonged to a prominent local family. The father was married. Not to her. Exposure would have destroyed multiple lives. A solution had been arranged. The infant was secretly raised elsewhere. Official records altered. Money provided quietly. The deception remained hidden for decades, until Eleanor discovered it. The inspector paused. Miss Marple remained very still. Neither seemed surprised. The clues had pointed in this direction for some time. Yet the next section changed everything. Eleanor had not merely learned about the child, she had learned the child's identity. And she recorded it, not by name, by initials, R.E., the same initials appearing in Arthur Bell's memorandum, Rose Ellingworth. The room fell silent. Pierce slowly lowered the diary. At last, the mystery of the child was solved. Rose herself had been the child. Her entire life rested upon a lie, a carefully maintained deception stretching back decades. But the diary contained more, much more. Eleanor had confronted someone, not the child's parents, not Arthur Bell. Someone else, a woman. The entries became noticeably emotional whenever this person appeared. Fear mixed with frustration, compassion mixed with anger. Eleanor believed the woman knew the truth. More importantly, she believed the woman had helped conceal it. The final entries grew increasingly urgent. One passage stood out immediately. She insists it was done for the child's protection. Perhaps that is true, yet protection can become imprisonment when it demands lifelong deception. Another entry followed 3 days later. Margaret agrees that Rose deserves the truth. Beatrice disagrees. She says disclosure would destroy too many people. We argued again today. Inspector Pierce looked up sharply. Beatrice. At last. The forgotten woman was moving toward the center of the story. The next entry had been written only 48 hours before Eleanor's death. The handwriting appeared hurried, uneven, almost frantic. I have decided. Rose must be told. I cannot continue pretending otherwise. Someone has already warned me to remain silent. I do not believe the threat will be carried out, but Margaret fears I am mistaken. The inspector felt a chill. Not because of the threat, because Eleanor had underestimated it. 2 days later she was dead. For several moments nobody spoke. The implications settled slowly. Then Miss Marple reached forward. There. Pierce followed her finger. A final entry. Short. Written on the day Eleanor died. The words occupied only 3 lines. Meeting this evening by the river. She finally agreed to talk. Perhaps everything can still be settled peacefully. The entry ended there. No name, no explanation, nothing further. The last words Eleanor Fairchild ever wrote. The silence afterward felt profound. At length Inspector Pierce spoke. "Beatrice Morrow." Miss Marple nodded. "Most likely." She opposed telling Rose. "Yes," she argued repeatedly with Eleanor. "Indeed." The inspector stood. A troubling possibility was emerging. Not certainty, but possibility. If Beatrice had feared exposure, if she believed revelation would destroy lives, if she met Eleanor beside the river, the implications were obvious. Yet Miss Marple did not look satisfied. She looked troubled, deeply troubled. The inspector noticed. "You disagree. I am uncertain." "About what?" She folded her hands. "The motive is correct." "Then?" "The emotions are wrong." Pierce frowned. "Explain." Miss Marple gazed at the diary. "People kill for fear." A pause. "They kill for greed." Another pause. "They kill to protect themselves." The inspector nodded. "Naturally." "But Beatrice spent years waiting for the truth." Her eyes lifted. "That does not fit." The observation lingered. Pierce could not dismiss it. If Beatrice wanted the truth hidden, why spend decades searching for answers herself? The contradiction remained unresolved. The answer arrived from an unexpected source. That afternoon, Rose Ellingworth requested another meeting. This time she appeared exhausted. The strain of revisiting old memories showed clearly, yet determination remained. "There is something I failed to tell you." Inspector Pierce listened carefully. "What?" Rose clasped her hands tightly. "Because I was ashamed. No one is judging you." A faint smile touched her face. "That's kind." Then it vanished. The next words emerged quietly. Beatrice wasn't protecting the secret. Silence followed. The inspector stared. "What do you mean?" Rose looked directly at him. She was trying to expose it. The room became utterly still. Everything changed, instantly, dramatically. Pierce felt the investigation shift beneath his feet. "But the diary only tells part of the story." Rose nodded slowly. Eleanor misunderstood. "How?" "Because Beatrice learned something later." The older woman took a breath, then continued. "Something Margaret Bellamy discovered." The name immediately recaptured everyone's attention. Margaret, again Margaret. Always somehow at the edge of events. "What did she discover?" Miss Marple asked softly. Rose closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, tears glistened there. The child wasn't the real secret. The sentence struck like a hammer. Inspector Pierce stared. "What?" "The deception about my identity was only part of it." Rose shook her head. "Margaret discovered something much worse." The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. At last, Rose continued. "The woman everyone believed was my mother." A pause. "Wasn't." The inspector felt his pulse quicken. Another layer. Another deception. Another secret hidden beneath the first. Rose spoke carefully. "As children, we are told stories about ourselves." Her voice trembled slightly. "We trust them." Another pause. "Sometimes they are lies." Miss Marple remained perfectly still, listening, observing, understanding. The older woman swallowed, then whispered, "My real mother was Eleanor's employer." The revelation stunned everyone. For several moments nobody spoke, because the significance was enormous. The scandal was not merely an affair, not merely an illegitimate birth. The identities involved were entirely different from what everyone believed, which meant someone had spent decades protecting the wrong version of the story. The discussion continued for another hour. By its conclusion, one fact emerged with startling clarity. Margaret Bellamy had uncovered the deeper truth shortly before Eleanor's death. She shared it with Beatrice. Together they began investigating. Then Eleanor died. Margaret disappeared. Beatrice withdrew from village life. And the truth vanished, or almost vanished, because Violet Harrow eventually picked up the trail, 21 years later. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked alone through the churchyard. The autumn light had begun to fade. Long shadows stretched between gravestones. Wind moved softly through the yew trees. She stopped beside Eleanor Fairchild's grave. For several minutes she remained there, thinking. The pieces were nearly assembled now. Not all, but enough. The motive, the secret, the pattern of fear, the attacks, the disappearances. Most importantly, the human relationships underneath them. Because murders are rarely committed by abstractions, not by scandals, not by secrets, not by documents. They are committed by people, and people possess hearts, wounded hearts, jealous hearts, terrified hearts. Miss Marple gazed at the weathered stone, then slowly smiled, a small smile, a sad one. At last she understood, not everything, but enough to see the shape of the truth, enough to recognize the killer. That night, shortly before midnight, another development arrived. Police searching Violet Harrow's London residence discovered a hidden notebook. The notebook contained names, dates, research notes, connections, years of investigation. Violet had been astonishingly thorough, yet one page stood apart from all the others, a page written only days before she left for Kings Abbot. At the top she had written a single sentence, underlined twice. I have been looking at the wrong person for 21 years. Beneath that sentence appeared one name, just one. When Inspector Pearce read it, he felt genuine shock, because the name was not Leonard Voss, not Harold Cresswell, not Margaret Bellamy, not even Beatrice Morrow. It belonged to someone who had remained almost invisible throughout the investigation. Someone everyone had overlooked. Someone Miss Marple had begun suspecting only hours earlier. The inspector immediately reached for the telephone, because if Violet's final conclusion was correct, the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's little gathering Sunday morning arrived bright and cold. A hard frost silvered the village rooftops. The church bells rang clearly through the still air. To anyone passing through Kings Abbot, the day appeared perfectly ordinary. Miss Marple knew better. By evening, one of the oldest secrets in the village would finally be exposed, and if she was correct, so would a murderer. Inspector Roland Pearce arrived at her cottage shortly after 9. He carried Violet Harrow's notebook. His expression suggested a man caught between excitement and frustration. You know who it is? Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. I believe so. You've believed so before. Yes. And? Sometimes I've been right. The inspector sighed. You enjoy this. Not in the slightest. She laid the knitting aside. Murders are sad things, Inspector. The quiet sincerity in her voice removed any trace of humour. Pearce nodded. He knew she meant it. The notebook rested between them, open to its final page. The page containing the name that had shocked the inspector. One name, one person, one individual who had appeared repeatedly at the edges of the mystery, without ever becoming its centre. The name was Beatrice Morrow. Yet Miss Marple had not been convinced. Not immediately, because something still felt wrong. The evidence pointed toward Beatrice. Too neatly, too conveniently, almost as though someone wanted it to. And that realization had led her toward the truth. Tell me again, she said, everything we know about Beatrice. The inspector obliged. Friend of Eleanor, member of village committees, engaged to Arthur Bell, believed to oppose revealing Rose's identity, later discovered to have actually supported investigation, abruptly left village affairs after Eleanor's death, spent years searching for answers, died 12 years earlier, A respected widow, quiet, unremarkable. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. The inspector frowned. What? She died 12 years ago? Yes, yet Violet believed she was still important. Pierce hesitated. I don't follow. Miss Marple smiled gently. Violet wasn't investigating Beatrice. A pause. She was investigating someone connected to Beatrice. The inspector stared, then slowly understood. Oh. The realization changed everything. Not Beatrice. Someone close to Beatrice. Someone who inherited her knowledge. Someone who understood the secret. Someone still alive. The inspector felt a sudden chill. Rose? Miss Marple shook her head. No. Margaret Bellamy. No. Then who? Miss Marple stood, walked toward the window, and looked out across her garden. Beatrice had a younger sister. The inspector froze. Edith Langley. The woman they had interviewed. The woman who spoke sadly of her sister. The woman who seemed cooperative. The woman nobody suspected. Miss Marple turned. The moment I met her, something troubled me. What? Her grief. The inspector blinked. Her grief. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. It was perfectly genuine. A pause. But directed toward the wrong person. The inspector remained silent, thinking, trying to catch up. Miss Marple continued. Edith spoke about Beatrice as though she had spent decades protecting her. Which seems natural. Not quite. Her expression sharpened slightly. Because several facts she knew should have been impossible. The inspector's eyes widened. Information from 1937. Precisely. Things Beatrice never recorded. Exactly. The silence that followed felt heavy. At last, Pierce spoke. You think Edith knew the truth all along. I think Edith learned it. From Beatrice. Miss Marple nodded. And unlike Beatrice, she reached a very different conclusion. The pieces suddenly aligned. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to see the outline. Enough to understand the danger. Violet discovered Edith. The inspector said it almost as a question. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and arranged to meet her. At the river, where Eleanor died. Again Miss Marple nodded. The room grew very quiet, because the implications were becoming obvious. Terribly obvious. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested what she referred to as a little gathering. Inspector Pierce privately hated the phrase. Miss Marple loved it. The gathering took place in the drawing room of the Black Swan Hotel, the largest private room available. Several invited guests arrived shortly before 4. Dr. Leonard Voss, Harold Cresswell, Rose Ellingworth, Mrs. Edith Langley, Constable Finch, and several others connected to the investigation. The atmosphere was uneasy. Nobody understood why they had been summoned, except Miss Marple and Inspector Pierce. Tea was served, polite conversation occurred, then Miss Marple rose. The room gradually fell silent. She clasped her hands lightly, a harmless elderly woman preparing to speak. At least that was how strangers often perceived her. The illusion never lasted long. I think, she said gently, that we finally understand what happened to Eleanor Fairchild. Nobody interrupted. 21 years ago, Eleanor discovered a family deception. She outlined the scandal carefully. Rose's concealed parentage, the efforts to protect reputations, the network of secrecy, the hidden documents, the recovered diary, every piece of the puzzle. Faces around the room grew increasingly tense, especially one face. Miss Marple noticed, so did the inspector. Then she reached the critical moment. Eleanor arranged a meeting beside the river. Silence. She expected a conversation. Another pause. Instead, she encountered someone terrified of the truth. Miss Marple's gaze drifted slowly across the room, not dramatic, not theatrical, simply observant. As often happens, fear became anger. The room remained utterly silent. Anger became violence. Another pause. Eleanor fell into the river. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. The frost outside seemed closer somehow. Miss Marple continued. For years, everyone suspected the wrong people. Her eyes briefly touched Leonard Voss, then Harold Cresswell. Both men looked exhausted, older somehow, yet the real answer was hidden elsewhere. She turned toward Edith Langley. The older woman's face remained calm, remarkably calm, perhaps too calm. You learned the truth from Beatrice, Miss Marple said it quietly, not accusing, simply stating. Edith stared at her, said nothing. You knew what Eleanor discovered, still silence. You also knew what Margaret Bellamy learned. The room felt frozen. Inspector Pierce watched carefully. Every expression, every gesture, every breath. Then Miss Marple delivered the final piece. Violet Harrow made the same mistake Eleanor made. At last Edith spoke. Her voice sounded perfectly steady. What mistake? Miss Marple looked directly at her. She believed you would choose honesty. The words landed like stones. Edith's face did not change. Yet something happened behind her eyes. Something small. Something dangerous. Miss Marple saw it instantly. The inspector saw it too. Recognition. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Edith laughed softly. A surprisingly pleasant sound. I suppose you've convinced yourself of this. No. Miss Marple shook her head. I don't rely upon conviction. The older woman smiled. What do you rely upon? Human nature. The smile faded slightly. Miss Marple continued. Beatrice wanted the truth exposed. Yes. She told you everything. No response. You disagreed. Still no response. Because you believed revelation would destroy innocent people. The room remained silent. At last Edith spoke again. Wouldn't it? Miss Marple's expression softened. A tiny sadness appeared there. Perhaps. The answer surprised everyone, even Edith. Then Miss Marple took a folded paper from her handbag. Violet's final notes. Recovered from London. The page naming Edith. The page Violet wrote shortly before leaving. The page proving she had solved the mystery. Inspector Pierce watched Edith carefully. The reaction was immediate. Not panic, not outrage, something far worse. Resignation. 21 years of it. The truth emerged slowly, painfully, like an old wound reopening. Edith finally lowered her head. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The calm remained, but exhaustion overwhelmed it. I never meant to hurt Eleanor. Nobody interrupted. She wouldn't stop. Another pause. She kept insisting people deserved the truth. Tears appeared. Not dramatic tears. Not theatrical ones. Simply grief. Very old grief. Perhaps she was right. The room remained silent. I don't know anymore. The confession arrived piece by piece. In 1937, Edith had learned the secret through Beatrice. Unlike her sister, she became convinced disclosure would destroy multiple lives. When Eleanor arranged the meeting by the river, Edith intended only to persuade her. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Emotions exploded. Then came a shove, a stumble, a fall. The river did the rest. The death was not planned, but the concealment was, and once the lie began, it never stopped. Years later, Violet Harrow uncovered the truth. She traced the connections, located witnesses, found evidence. Eventually, she identified Edith and returned to Kings Abbot. The meeting at the river had been arranged deliberately, just like Eleanor's, just like history repeating itself. The room remained completely silent. Everyone waited for the final answer, the question that mattered most. Inspector Pierce finally asked it. Violet. Edith closed her eyes. For several moments she could not speak. Then, I didn't kill her. The answer surprised everyone, especially Miss Marple, because she believed it, instantly, completely. The old woman opened her eyes. I swear it. Miss Marple studied her carefully. The exhaustion, the grief, the honesty. Then she slowly nodded, and for the first time since the gathering began, uncertainty entered the room. Because if Edith killed Eleanor, but did not kill Violet, then the most recent murder remained unsolved, and somewhere beyond the walls of the Black Swan Hotel, the true killer of Violet Harrow was still free. Chapter 11. The Dead Woman's Room. For nearly 10 minutes after Edith Langley's confession, nobody spoke. The silence was not comfortable. It carried the peculiar weight that follows a revelation long anticipated and yet somehow shocking when it finally arrives. Outside, evening settled over Kings Abbot. Inside, the Black Swan Hotel, everyone remained seated exactly where they were, as though movement itself might disturb the fragile shape of the truth. Miss Marple sat quietly, thinking, listening, observing, most importantly, doubting, because something was wrong, very wrong. Edith had confessed. The confession fit, the motive fit, the argument fit, even the accidental nature of Eleanor's death fit. Human beings often imagined murder as something dramatic, planned, calculated. In reality, many deaths emerged from moments of panic, fear, anger, desperation. Eleanor's death now made tragic sense, yet Violet's disappearance did not. Not entirely, not even close. Miss Marple knew it, and deep down, so did Inspector Pierce. The gathering eventually dispersed. Rose Ellingworth departed quietly. Harold Cresswell looked 20 years older. Dr. Leonard Voss remained seated for some time after everyone else left. His gaze fixed upon nothing. The burden he had carried for 2 decades was finally gone. Yet relief did not seem to accompany it, only sadness, a great deal of sadness. Miss Marple understood. Truth often arrived too late. Later that evening, Inspector Pierce accompanied her home. Neither spoke much during the walk. The village streets were nearly empty. Cold air drifted through the hedgerows. At last the inspector broke the silence. "You don't believe Edith killed Violet?" "No." The answer arrived immediately, without hesitation. "Neither do I." Miss Marple nodded. The inspector frowned. "Yet Violet named her." "Yes." "Tracked her." "Indeed." "Arranged to meet her." "Quite." The inspector sighed. "Then why isn't she the answer?" Miss Marple stopped walking. For a moment she gazed toward the distant church tower. Then, "Because of room 7. The inspector blinked. "What?" "The hotel room." Silence. Then, "The room reserved for Violet Harrow." Pierce stared, slowly, very slowly. He felt something shift, something important. Miss Marple resumed walking. "You remember what bothered me from the beginning? The churchyard view." "Exactly." She smiled faintly. "Violet specifically requested that room." The inspector nodded. "Yes." "But why?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. "Because after weeks of investigation, they still lacked a convincing answer." Miss Marple continued. "She arrived in Kings Abbot." "Yes." "Visited the river." "Yes." "Met Edith." "Yes." A pause. "Yet she never checked into the hotel." The inspector frowned. "Correct. That should have happened afterward." Another pause. "Instead, it never happened." The pieces began rearranging themselves. Back at the police station, Pierce remained awake long after midnight. Files covered his desk. Photographs, statements, letters, maps. For the first time since the investigation began, he ignored Eleanor entirely, ignored Edith, ignored the 1937 tragedy. Instead, he focused solely upon Violet, her movements, her intentions, her decisions, and suddenly, several things became obvious. Things that should have been obvious sooner. Violet paid in advance, reserved a specific room, requested a specific view, travelled with luggage, prepared for a 5-night stay. Those were not the actions of a woman expecting a brief meeting and immediate departure. They suggested a plan, a purpose, a longer investigation, which raised an uncomfortable question. Why reserve room 7 before speaking to Edith? Why insist upon that room before arriving in Kings Abbot? The answer arrived just before dawn, and when it did, Pierce sat upright in his chair, because it was so simple, so obvious, so completely overlooked. Violet wanted the room because she intended to watch something, not remember it, watch it. The next morning, Miss Marple received the inspector's telephone call. His excitement was unmistakable. "You were right. I often am." The response sounded pleasantly innocent. Pierce ignored it. "The churchyard." "Yes? We've been looking at it backward." Miss Marple smiled. She already suspected. "Go on." Violet didn't want to look at the graves. No, she wanted to look at something else visible from that window. Exactly. The inspector almost laughed. The realization felt liberating and infuriating, because it should have occurred much sooner. Within an hour, both stood inside room 7. For the first time, they examined the view properly. Not emotionally, practically. The churchyard stretched below, gravestones, yew trees, stone walls. Then, there, Miss Marple pointed, a narrow footpath, partially hidden by trees, running behind the churchyard, almost invisible from ground level, perfectly visible from room 7. The inspector followed it with his eyes. The path led toward an abandoned rectory, vacant for years. Rarely visited, almost forgotten. By noon, police were searching the building. The abandoned rectory stood silent beneath bare branches. Dust coated every surface. Windows rattled softly in the wind. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Then Constable Finch found the door, hidden behind old shelving in a storage room. A concealed chamber, small, windowless, unused for decades, or so it appeared, until they discovered recent footprints. The search intensified. Moments later, another officer shouted. Inspector Pierce hurried across the room. A suitcase rested beneath a blanket, dark green, brass corners. Violet Harrow's suitcase. The same suitcase, supposedly recovered near the river. Everyone froze. For several seconds, nobody spoke, because only one conclusion was possible. The suitcase found near the river had been planted, deliberately, to mislead investigators. Then came the second discovery, far worse. A handbag, women's clothing, a notebook, personal items, and finally, a skeleton key. The inspector stared at it. Recognition arrived instantly. The Black Swan Hotel, room keys. Miss Marple examined the key quietly, then looked around the hidden room. The truth emerged all at once, not gradually, not piece by piece, all at once, like a curtain lifting. She finally understood everything. Violet had met Edith. That part was true. The conversation occurred. The confrontation occurred. The revelation occurred. Then Violet left, alive, completely alive. Edith never saw her again. Instead, Violet went somewhere else. Somewhere she believed would provide proof. Proof connected to the abandoned rectory. Proof she intended to observe from room 7. Proof involving someone she had not yet fully identified. Someone she was watching. The hidden chamber contained one final item. A ledger, small, leather-bound, recently used. Inspector Pierce opened it. His face changed immediately. Names filled the pages. Dates, meetings, payments, correspondence. Every entry connected to one person. One individual who had quietly maintained contact with numerous figures in the case, including Margaret Bellamy, including Violet Harrow, including Edith Langley. The same individual appeared repeatedly, again, and again, and again, always helpful, always cooperative, always nearby, yet somehow never suspected. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. The answer felt almost unbearable, because it was so ordinary, so human, so painfully simple. The killer had not hidden through brilliance. The killer had hidden through usefulness. Everyone trusted useful people. Everyone overlooked them. That evening she requested another gathering, a smaller one, more private. Inspector Pierce immediately agreed, because now he understood. The first gathering exposed Eleanor's killer. The second would expose Violet's. As darkness settled over Kings Abbot, Miss Marple sat alone beside her fire. The final pieces rested neatly in place. The hidden room, the planted evidence, the surveillance point, the false trail, Margaret Bellamy's disappearance, Violet's investigation, everything finally aligned. She felt no satisfaction, only sadness, because once again the answer came down to something familiar: fear. Fear preserved across decades, fear transformed into habit, and eventually into murder. Outside, wind moved softly through the churchyard trees. Room 7 remained empty. The room reserved for a dead woman, a room intended to observe the truth, a room Violet Harrow never lived long enough to occupy. And tomorrow, Miss Marple intended to reveal exactly why. Chapter 12. What the Room Was Watching. Monday afternoon arrived beneath a pale autumn sun. The storm that had lingered over Kings Abbot for weeks, both literal and figurative, had finally begun to break. Clouds drifted lazily across the sky. The village carried on as villages always do. Milk deliveries arrived. Church notices were posted. Garden gates creaked. Yet beneath the surface, the final chapter of a 21-year mystery was about to unfold. Miss Marple's second gathering was considerably smaller than the first. Only those directly connected to the investigation were invited. Inspector Pierce, Constable Finch, Dr. Leonard Voss, Harold Cresswell, Rose Ellingworth, Edith Langley, and one final guest, Mrs. Agnes Holloway, the retired postmistress. The elderly woman appeared mildly confused by the invitation. Miss Marple expected that. So did the killer. The meeting took place once again at the Black Swan Hotel. This time, however, Miss Marple requested room 7 itself, the room reserved for Violet Harrow, the room overlooking the churchyard, the room that had started everything. The symbolism was deliberate. Everyone gathered awkwardly inside the cramped room. The view stretched beyond the window. Churchyard, yew trees, the narrow hidden path, the abandoned rectory beyond. At first nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple rose. "I believe," she said quietly, "that we now understand both deaths." The room fell silent. She began with Eleanor. The explanation was straightforward. Tragic, human. Edith Langley's confession accounted for everything. The argument, the panic, the fall into the river, the years of silence. Nothing further remained to solve. Edith sat quietly throughout, exhausted, broken, yet oddly relieved. The burden of 21 years had finally lifted. Then Miss Marple turned toward the second crime, Violet Harrow. The atmosphere changed immediately. Because this mystery remained alive, its killer still sat among them. Violet came to Kings Abbot seeking proof. Miss Marple spoke calmly, methodically, not merely answers. A pause. Proof. She described the hotel reservation, the churchyard view, the hidden path, the abandoned rectory, the concealed chamber, the planted suitcase, every discovery, every deception. The pieces fit together perfectly. Now, Inspector Pierce watched the faces around him carefully. Most appeared confused. One did not. One face remained utterly still. Too still. Miss Marple noticed, and continued. Violet met Edith Langley. She nodded toward the older woman. She learned the truth about Eleanor. Another pause. But she also learned something else. Silence. Someone had been maintaining contact with everyone connected to the original secret. The room remained quiet. Margaret Bellamy, Rose Ellingworth, Edith Langley. A pause, and eventually Violet herself. Miss Marple moved toward the window. The autumn light touched her silver hair. She looked remarkably frail, remarkably harmless. Appearances, as always, were deceptive. Violet realized someone had been quietly monitoring the investigation. Her voice softened. Someone who knew far too much. Another pause. Someone who always seemed helpful. Then she turned and looked directly at Agnes Holloway, the retired postmistress. The room froze. No one moved, no one spoke. Agnes stared back. For several seconds her expression remained unchanged. Then the faintest smile appeared and vanished. Inspector Pierce felt his pulse quicken. Not surprise. Recognition. Because now he saw it too. Every piece, every connection, every overlooked detail. Miss Marple continued gently. The village postmistress. A pause. What better position could exist? Agnes said nothing. You handled correspondence. Addresses. Forwarding requests. Private letters. Another pause. Information. The old woman remained silent. The explanation unfolded steadily. Years earlier, Eleanor had unknowingly revealed concerns in letters. Margaret Bellamy exchanged correspondence. Beatrice Morrow exchanged correspondence. Rose Ellingworth exchanged correspondence. Violet Harrow exchanged correspondence. And Agnes Holloway had access to all of it. Not every letter, not always, but enough. More than enough. The hidden letters discovered in the church wall suddenly made sense. Someone intercepted them. Repeatedly. Systematically. Not to protect others. To protect herself. Because Agnes knew the deeper truth. A truth she had concealed for decades. Rose Ellingworth stared in disbelief. Why? The word emerged almost as a whisper. Miss Marple answered before Agnes could. Because Agnes was the woman in the photograph. Silence exploded across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Agnes closed her eyes briefly. The gesture itself was answer enough. The hidden figure, the observer among the trees, the unidentified woman, there from the beginning. Watching, listening, learning, always nearby, always forgotten, Miss Marple continued quietly. Eleanor discovered the secret. Margaret Bellamy investigated it. Beatrice learned part of it. Another pause. But Agnes learned everything. The room felt smaller suddenly. The walls closer. The air heavier. For years, Agnes had maintained control through information. The village postmistress knew everyone's business, their correspondence, their relationships, their movements. People told her things, trusted her, confided in her. Exactly as they always had, exactly as Violet eventually did. Then came the final revelation, the motive behind Violet's murder, not the old scandal, not Rose's parentage, not Eleanor's death, something far simpler, far more dangerous. Recognition. Violet recognized Agnes. The old photograph had contained more than one clue. Violet eventually noticed what everyone else missed. The woman hidden among the trees possessed a distinctive limp. The same limp described by Ruth Ellison. The same limp Agnes had carried for decades following an old cycling accident. A detail so ordinary nobody thought about it. Until Violet did. Agnes finally spoke. Her voice sounded tired. Very tired. You make it sound deliberate. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Wasn't it? For several moments Agnes said nothing. Then, no. The answer echoed Edith's earlier confession. And, somehow, sounded equally tragic. The truth emerged slowly, in fragments, broken pieces of memory. 21 years earlier, Agnes had confronted Eleanor before the river meeting. She feared exposure, not because of Rose, because of herself. Agnes had helped alter records, intercept letters, conceal identities. The scandal implicated people she loved, people she believed she was protecting. Then Eleanor died. The secret survived, and Agnes spent decades ensuring it remained buried. When Violet arrived in Kings Abbot, history repeated itself. At first Agnes merely watched. Then she realized Violet was dangerously close, closer than anyone before her, closer even than Margaret Bellamy, who had vanished years earlier after receiving anonymous warnings and fleeing under another name. Margaret was alive, but terrified. Terrified enough to disappear twice. Violet, however, refused to run. She continued investigating, continued watching, continued asking questions. Then she recognized Agnes. Everything changed. The confrontation occurred inside the abandoned rectory. Not at the river, not at the churchyard, inside the hidden chamber, the place Agnes used to monitor correspondence and meetings without attracting attention. Violet arrived alone, expecting answers. Instead, she found danger. The struggle that followed was brief, unplanned, chaotic, just as Eleanor's death had been. Violet struck her head during the fall. She never regained consciousness. Panic followed. Then concealment. Again, history repeating itself for a second time. Agnes lowered her head. Tears appeared. Not dramatic, not manipulative, simply exhausted. I never meant. The sentence died unfinished, because there was nothing left to say. Inspector Pierce finally stood. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Agnes offered her wrists. No resistance, no argument, no denial, only surrender. The investigation was over. The room remained silent after she was escorted away. Outside, church bells began ringing the hour. The sound drifted softly through the open window, almost peaceful. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage. A fire crackled gently. The mystery had ended. Yet endings rarely felt triumphant. 2 women were dead. Several lives had been shaped by lies. Others had spent decades carrying guilt. Truth had arrived. But truth always came at a price. She thought about Eleanor, idealistic, determined, unable to ignore injustice. Then Violet, patient, persistent, brave enough to continue searching after 21 years. Both women had pursued the same thing. Not revenge, truth, simply truth. Outside, darkness settled over Kings Abbot. The churchyard stood quiet beneath moonlight. The hidden path remained empty. The abandoned rectory would soon be sealed permanently, and room 7, the room reserved for a dead woman, finally stood vacant, its purpose fulfilled, its mystery solved. The window still overlooked the churchyard, still overlooked the path, still overlooked the place where secrets had travelled unseen for decades. Yet now there was nothing left to watch, nothing left to hide. A few weeks later, life gradually returned to normal, as much as life ever does after tragedy. Rose Ellingworth finally learned the complete truth of her past. Dr. Leonard Voss found peace he had not known since 1937. Harold Cresswell resumed his quiet routines. Edith Langley prepared to face the consequences of her confession, and Kings Abbot returned to its ordinary rhythms, outwardly unchanged, inwardly transformed. One afternoon, while tending her roses, Miss Marple reflected upon the case. Human beings, she thought, often imagine great crimes require great villains. That was rarely true. Most tragedies began with smaller things: fear, pride, love, shame. A single lie told for what seemed a good reason, then another, until nobody remembered where the deception began. She clipped a fading rose, placed it gently into a basket, and smiled faintly, a sad smile, but a peaceful one, because at last, after 21 years, the dead had finally been heard, and the room reserved for a dead woman no longer needed to wait. The end.